Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce Niklaus Largier, who is a professor of German and comparative literature at UC Berkeley, and the author, at least his most recent book, is Figures of Possibility, Mysticism, Aesthetic Experience, and the Play of the Sense. Was published for Stanford in 2022. And today, for our series, he will give a talk whose title is Mysticism, Practice, and the Materiality of the Imagination. Please join me in welcoming Niklaus.
Thank you very much for so I don't have to care about that. For the introduction and for being here. So it's a pleasure, as I said, it's always just gorgeous to walk around a little bit here on the campus. It's really beautiful. And thanks to Nick, who kind of initiated this somehow in conversation with Berkeley or with me at Berkeley. And when we talked, that was somewhat undecided. We had said, what should I talk about in the context of my work on mysticism? And we talked about, should it be something on the 16th century social revolutionaries and their mystical inspiration, or how they connect to the tradition? We talked about Walter Benjamin and mysticism. What I finally decided on is to speak a little bit about mysticism's critical potentials, and I see it as it appears also in our current moment. And then mostly in the second part of the talk about this medieval prehistory, being history of consciousness. It makes sense. So I'll set it up that way. And avoiding a possible need to define what I mean by mysticism, I just want to draw attention to some moments where the use of the term has been increasingly present in the recent years. This includes just very short memory beyond a conference on mysticism and psychedelics at Berkeley a few weeks ago, an indicator of definitely a specific field of interest in mysticism that is somewhat emerging, at least at Berkeley, very strongly, and in the Bay Area. Then a number of somewhat remarkable number of recent announcements of graduate student conferences, etc., where mysticism appears as a topic, but also in a wide range of literature that rediscovers mysticism in discussions about, just to name a few areas, new materialism, eco-criticism, political theology, and critical race theory. I'll start with some references to that, particularly Fred Moten's Blackness and Nothingness, and then more recently a book by J. Cameron Carter, The Anarchy of Black Religion, which has a chapter or a part which is called, I think, Mystical Songs or something like that, and which includes also a large discussion of the work of Nathaniel Mackey, who also would be an author who could be considered in that context. At the first glance, surprisingly, medieval and early modern figures play often an important role in these discussions. Among them, the medieval figure, most famously Meister Eckhart, the German Dominican mystic, preacher, philosopher, and then the early modern figure of Jakob Böhme, particularly in conversations about a new philosophy of nature and about eco-critical perspectives. That's really where Böhme had kind of a moment now. But also then the women authors, Mechtir of Magdeburg, Hadewig of Antwerp, Margaret Porret. The latter have already played an important role in a phase of French feminism. For example, in the work of Hélène Cixous, Julia Kristeva, Luce Irigaray, where these women mystics are not only seen as drawing attention to a long forgotten history of female authorship, but also to specific understandings of writing, embodiment, and an emphasis of what I like to call the materiality of the imagination. The critical perspective elaborated first in a French feminist vein of thought, I would say. Oh, very good. The critical perspective elaborated, I feel somewhat watched. Like a visceral thing going on. The critical perspective elaborated first in a French feminist vein of thought resonates most recently in the book I just mentioned by J. Cameron Carter, with a critique of Western imposition and naturalization of racist discourse. I'm quoting from Carter's text in order to illustrate one of the moments where recent critical writing enters into a conversation with the mystical textual archive. Carter writes the following, referring to a discussion of Toni Morrison's Beloved by Zakia Iman Jackson, and by her foregrounding of, I quote, processes of relinquishing one's identification and, as she says, the redefining of gender and being in improvisational terms. I'm quoting a longer passage from Carter's book. Jackson's use of the word relinquish here is quite interesting, not because it seemingly echoes the idea of letting be, and then in German Gelassenheit, as Martin Heidegger uses this term within his philosophical arsenal, but rather because of the term's deeper lineage within dissident mysticisms of the West, particularly the mysticism of Meister Eckhart, and even more important, behind Eckhart, the Begin mysticism of Margaret Poet. We could add other women figures here, Hannevich, etc. There's a whole range of women authors in the later Middle Ages who are interesting in this context. Then the quote goes on, Poet was given the epithet pseudo-woman, pseudo-mulier, for her mysticism of apophatic unsaying. Developed in her Mirror of Simple Souls, which is believed to have been written somewhere between 1296 and 1306, Poet's mysticism unsays a substantialist deity. Following this, her mysticism unsays gender essentialism. She does away with the stable idea of the human just on its modernist, racial, capitalist congealing. So the location here is important, the historical location of Marguerite for Carter at the kind of a threshold where then we could also think about the revolutionary movements of the 16th century and their inspiration at that moment of emerging colonialism, emerging capitalism, and these counter voices, as he sees them, playing an important role here, with the emphasis of this, unsaying a substantialist deity, unsaying gender essentialism, etc. I continue with the quote. As she burns away opposites and distinctions of separability, and in this echoes, as it were, an unoriginal love that posits no distinctions through separability. Church authorities, invested as they were in hierarchies or orders of separability, turn her over to the secular army for burning at the stake, which happened in Paris in 1305, I think. Thus, thinking with Margaret Poet, Carter asks us to enter into a dialogue that goes far beyond the understanding of Gelassenheit as an individual attitude or subjective relation to the world or to the divine. Instead, he is interested in, quote again, Poet's relinquishing, which Meister Eckhart will take up and make more well known in his sermons, and where, quote again, the mysticism of relinquishment points to a pre-creative condition of existing without separability. Thus, he emphasizes, he being Carter, what he calls the dissident, deformative, pseudo-woman mysticism. He continues in a conclusion that resonates with Fred Moten's references to mysticism in his Blackness and Nothingness, Mysticism in the Flesh, thus Moten's, the title of Moten's text. Carter writes, I want to route Jackson's statement in a Poretian, Eckhartian direction, which I further want to stage as a kind of proto-Black religious direction, the direction of a kind of Black mysticism. What comes into view here in Carter's way of addressing racial capitalism is mysticism as a practice first of undoing, or I should say, it's first mysticism as a practice, and then a practice that entails undoing and unsaying structures along the lines that more traditionally arguing with Althusser, we could call them modern frames of interpellation as they emerge throughout modernity. That is gender, race, identity, etc. This undoing is, in the vision of the mystics, an apophatic reorientation, a moment of negative theology, etc., that moves away from the determined notions of the human, the individual, and of the divine. What Carter draws from the Begin mystics, Poret and Eckhart, is this application of negative theology not only to the divine as unknowable, but equally to the human. Not only God is unknowable, but the human is equally unknowable, and all positive determination of the human as this or that is a form of, we could call it without this interpellation, a form of imposition. We can speak of a negative anthropology here, or with the Austrian modernist author Robert Musil, who is also inspired and actually references the mystics in that context, what he calls Gestaltlosigkeit is mentioned, the undeterminedness or formlessness of the human. And alluding to the title of his modernist novel, Der Mensch ohne Eigenschaften, der Mann ohne Eigenschaften, der Mensch ohne Eigenschaften, the human without qualities. This is the first aspect in Carter's line of thought or reference to the mystics that is being emphasized, namely this moment of indeterminacy, nothingness, imagelessness, to work with a term that plays an important role in the mystics. A second aspect, also foregrounded by Carter, and maybe it's more surprising, is an anarchic moment and the perspective of what he calls constant origination, constant regeneration without origin, unending beginningness. In the language of the mystics, we can call it the vision or the understanding of creatio continua is the technical term in medieval theology. That is creation not as something that happened at some point, but as something that is happening all the time. And that's then understood along certain lines, maybe more platonically, with a kind of emanation and in other terms as well. So coming forth of all things and participation in this coming forth. And I can add a little footnote here, because in the German, this is in a way more immediately graspable, where imagination is appearing here in Eckhart's text as Einbildung, Einbildungskraft. So is connected, as the Latin is, with becoming image or becoming form. And the mystic discourse of Eckhart very strongly works with this semantic potential there of bilden, entbilden, überbilden, etc. So all terms that actually resonate with something that is the material ground of all beings. So the world itself is continuously in a process of imagination, and participation for him is participation in that imagination, becoming world, so to speak, something that also the notion of creatio continua, the continuous creation, emphasizes. This takes shape, this participation in the texts of the Beguines and of Meister Eckhart as reimagining improvisation and experimental, Carter calls it improvisational work that anchors itself not in determined identities or subjectivities, but in processes of formation that, time and again, work against stable structures of affirmation in emphasizing the elaboration of new forms for inhabiting the world, forms that rejoin the ever ongoing coming forth of worlds, and what we can call with the mystics a process, as I just pointed out, of material imagination, even beyond or also beyond an anthropocentric focus, to use that word. Maybe better, you could say also below the distinction of spirit and matter, distinction of human creatures and gods, to push that line a little bit here. And when you think of just this along this line, somewhat poetically, I would always, if you're interested in reading some of the texts, Mayfield of Magdeburg is maybe one of the most fascinating authors who experiments with genres, with textual possibilities along these lines in a way that really can be called experimental and improvisational, kind of drawing on the archives of language material from the Bible, from memory, etc. I'll come back to that, and recomposing it all the time without ever producing an image of a stable identity or an identity that can be stabilized. Now, I've always been a big fan of the term that came with Aldo, Foucault, philosophy as spiritual exercise, and to go back to that, and a fan obviously of these, reading these techniques that we see in the mystics, both of ascetic practice, of prayer and meditation, etc., as exercises of the self. And in recent time, I became somewhat more skeptical whether we don't impose even yet just too much modern selfhood there. And something to think about, or something for myself, because it always made so much sense that philosophy is actually, or has been, should have been understood along the lines of classical philosophical understanding that Aldo worked out as an exercise of the self. But in these texts, there's actually more at stake, and it is more at stake in terms of engagement with the creaturely in its breath, so to speak. When I talk about this material, I want to keep this engagement with the mystics. I want to draw attention maybe from the beginning to a kind of typology of mysticism that I'm working with, that also that I'm working against. There have been in the engagement with so-called mystical text two main tendencies that I try to avoid. One is that one that is interested above all in, we could say, fixated on the moments of ecstatic intensity that so-called mystical texts testify to. And the other one is the tendency to read mysticism, particularly in terms of histories of esoteric knowledge that are handed down. Just to illustrate the first one quickly, in reading Mayfield of Magdeburg, or for that matter, maybe much more prominently, Teresa of Avila, was the most well-known scene from that history. Readers and interpreters tend to get mesmerized by the overwhelming experience of the divine in the most famous passage from her life, that is mostly known through the famous sculpture by the Baroque artist John Lorenzo Bernini. And I think you all know that picture. It's on the cover of Lacan Ancker, and it's in many places. Teresa next does it, and that is or has become somewhat the paradigm of what the mystics' intensity of experiences, which foregrounds something that is important and that is fascinating, but at the same time does so while forgetting her, to reference Teresa, that she says, oh, and it took me 23 years of prayer. So what happened during these 23 years of prayer is actually in many ways much more interesting than the spectacular event there. In working on the basis of Carter's observations and modernist engagements with mysticism, I read the textual tradition not primarily in the light of these moments of intensity or of the tradition of esoteric knowledge, but of the practice, we could call it, and method it proposes, and that forms the background of Eckhart's, Mechtil's, Hallevi's, Margaret Porres, Teresa's interventions. In other words, I focus on the moment of relinquishing and what it entails both critically and constructively. What readers focusing on the scenes of ecstatic union tend to overlook is the very methodology, we could call it, concretely the very practice of prayer and meditation that precedes and underlies ecstatic experience of everyday entanglements, and that cannot be understood as a practice of producing a stable human self. It is this practice and method that I want to emphasize here. With an emphasis on the material imagination, I also move away both from the somewhat disembodied forms that the recent emphasis on, in my opinion, psychedelic mysticism often foreground. In addition, what readers focused on esoteric knowledge tend to overlook is both the critical and the experimental character of these practices. That is, the way in which they are invested in a critique of the seemingly natural state of living and inhabiting the world. What is at stake is what we would nowadays call naturalized states, states that are established culturally as natural, and to in that critique and move and go beyond that naturalized understanding and living is a goal of the practices. What they focus on is the formation and reformation of perception, affects, and cognition in their temporal extension. And that's why I emphasize that aspect or make it stronger than the ecstatic moments. So it is an active practice of deconstructing the cultural construct of nature and the natural, and a reformation of perceptions, affects, and cognition in and of the world. In short, we could say it's a reformation of the ways we inhabit the world, where landscapes of the soul take shape. I like this expression, landscapes of the soul, in its undefinedness. And it is the latter that I see as truly decisive and often ignored in the engagement with mystical texts from the early 20th century up to many of the most recent appropriations. I'm not going to name any, but there's many books of mysticism that all kind of focus on these, always around these intensities and the idealization also of these ecstatic moments in their, that I acknowledge, very fascinating, transgressive power. What I foreground then in this context are three moments that are characteristic that in particular also modernist thinkers and writers re-emerged. Maybe if I have time, I'm not sure how far that goes. I'll say a few words about the Austrian writer Robert Musil as an example of somebody who in his novelistic poetics actually builds very strongly on an engagement with the mystics, but there are others we can think of in the German tradition. Rilke would be an obvious example, but then also Wallace Stevens, even John Cage very strongly, and Marcel Duchamp. There are others that can be named. In my way, they do not return to a paradigm of esoteric or spiritual knowledge or experience, but they read the mystical texts as deeply invested in a critical praxis of what we might call a reformation of perception, affect, and thought that is largely improvisational, experimental, etc., and that moves beyond the limits of naturalized, gendered, racialized, and anthropologically determined patterns of interpellation. And I think it's an interesting, again, as a little footnote, perspective to keep in mind when we think about the resurgence and the interest in mysticism around 1900 and in the early decades of the 20th century. You find obviously different lines. There are some people who are very deeply invested in what I call here now for practical purposes, the esoteric knowledge that is handed down. But what I find much more significant in at least a group of modernist writers, that it is an interest in the experimental potential of the rhetoric that they find in the mystics, and how this rhetoric is actually invested in and helps to produce new perceptual arrangements with artificial means. I'll try to illustrate this. In order to do so, I want to return to the practice of prayer as a practice we could call of defiguration and experimental refiguration. It is this practice that forms the background of mystical texts, and I would say not only in the Christian, but also in Islam, in the Jewish tradition, in other traditions as well. And you can think of defiguration actually very, very literally as that moment of relinquishing, withdrawing, a moment of negativity, of undoing, unsaying that Carter foregrounded. You can make it even more literal. You can think of it as withdrawing into the cell in the monastery, or even more radical, withdrawing into the desert, or then in a play with that figure in I always quote the Huysmans' Huysmans' novel against English titles, usually Against Nature, where the decadent protagonist withdraws into his country house, in that sense, defiguring, withdrawing from the naturalized world, and reestablishes a production, an experimental refiguration that produces a new perception of the world. In my work, it has always one of the texts of reference, and something I see as a really significant text is Hugo St. Victor's treatise on prayer. Prayer is here seen as a form of exercise that, making use of rhetorical devices and their specific effects, produces a new form of perception and cognition that entails sensual, affective, and intellectual elements. As I argue, prayer thus foregrounds rhetorical effects. We could say a phenomenology of rhetorical effects, which is not a phenomenology but as a primary level, but the phenomenology of what happens if I now move through this text, for example, or what happens if I now surround myself with an installation of text, image, and music in this situation of withdrawal, and how can I reform perception at that moment? And it is this experimental setup that is really what interests medieval monks, and not in that highly artificial, one must call it, in that highly artificial new environment that they are producing for themselves. As I said, foregrounds rhetorical effects and the phenomenology of these effects. What I also find remarkable there, what has become important for me, is that this actually moved outside of the hermeneutic engagement with the word and with text. So they're not interested in the reading of the scriptures, which you could say is the basic exercise that inspires in terms of accumulation of more and more or deeper and deeper hermeneutic understanding of the text, but in a way of reading in which the text turns into, we could call it a stimulant, and in which this energetic moment of the rhetorical figures is being deployed. And that seems to be at the center. So I'll talk about this, how Hugo St. Victor thinks about this in a moment, and then I come also to the question of the investment of the senses in that process. As Hugo St. Victor shows in his treatise, the practice of prayer is highly informed by rhetorical tradition and training. And when I say rhetorical tradition and training, I really mean a tradition that thinks about not just persuasion. Persuasion is one case, and obviously rhetoric is invested in persuasion, but persuasion as producing a state in which something is perceived or experienced as evident, as a new form of evidence about the world, the trees, etc., all of that. Prayer meant to lead into a state of what he calls a loving excitement, a loving entanglement with the world, of intense and overwhelming love, is first and foremost an art and the temporal process of arousing and forming affects and emotions, as he says, that forgets its own intention. A pure prayer, I quote here a line, is when from an abundance of devotion the mind is so enkindled that when it turns to ask something of God, it forgets even its petition because of the greatness of his love. Thus, prayer is to be understood at first in terms of an exercise that distances itself from the established patterns of the world and arouses the affects in movements of stimulation with the help of rhetorical devices, tropes, figures, etc. But you can add anything. There's the addition of music that plays a very important role in this context, and the addition of images. It does so in a way that not only evokes the affect of overwhelming love, but lays out and deploys, as it writes, from the ground of the soul, innumerable forms of affects, that's Hume's word, affects are innumerable, that can be experienced. He says the number of these affects is infinite, making it impossible for him to count them all. These affects emerge in a practice that moves from a state of unexcited reading or remembering of the sacred texts to moments of intense perception and emotional arousal, we could call it, making the forming of the cognition in this process also explicit. So it's I'll come back to it. The transition to the state of arousal happens in meditation, which exercises a shaping force on the ways of perception, assimilating the life of the soul to the effects of figures and tropes. As he writes, meditation produces this intensity through frequent mental re-evocation, a process of rumination and mastication that includes sensual and emotional perception, as well as a practice of the imagination and of intellectual evaluation of the phenomena that are being created. In fact, exercises in question delve into the imaginal layers, we could say, that make up the entanglements of what the term soul refers to in these texts. The basis of the practice consists in an engagement with the constitutive environment of the life of the soul. It is here that detachment, or this unsaying, has its place as a loosening of all interpellative forces, and on the other side, we could say, as the basis of an improvisational, I call it sometimes a material mimesis, a practice of figuration that then shapes a new cognitive life of the soul. In its elementary form, Hugh points out the practice of prayer starts with enumeration, the construction of lists, configuration of tropes drawn from the scriptures, from life experience, from lives of saints and martyrs, from memory, from other available sources, etc. So it is really this compositional, experimental, improvisational arsenal or procedure that is at stake. So, for example, Hugh argues a list of pains and the enumeration of all possible evils produce the effect that the soul experiences a specific set of affects and of affective relations to its environment. The context you developed this, maybe it's important to remind ourselves of that, is he said, so why do we actually, asking, it's a text written for monks nuns in the 12th century, why do we pray texts that don't ask for anything? But that's kind of the point of origin. And then he brings in the Psalms, so the example that is everybody is praying the Psalms all the time without actually an intention. And then he starts thinking about the praying of the Psalms, and he says, the praying of the Psalms, actually, we don't pray them again. It's the tension between that and the hermeneutic reading. We don't go to a deeper understanding of this or that at first, but we do it in order to reshape, as I would call it, reshape our perception, to reshape the affective life at first. But it's again not just that. It is more like I always call it the somewhat Deleuzian model of a circulation then of perceptual moments, affective moments, moments of understanding, but never moving to a conclusive moment of identification. It's always the relinquishing that then breaks it again, and that makes you, I say, in the process, return into that process. So into that circular moment of moving through this. So what you emphasize in this short treatise is not only the production of specific signs and states of affective experience, but we could call it a cognitive texture or cognitive textures, and the very transition from one to the other. Often he writes the singing of the Psalms means exactly that, namely the production of patterns of affects of that kind, then moving through them, moving into others, etc., transitioning from one affect to the other, and so on. So the improvisational element is actually very, very important there. In other words, meditation as a rhetorical practice of the evocation and formation of cognitive potentials with the help of lists, enumeration of words, etc., produces textures of affective and sensual perception that can be savored, experienced, and phenomenologically explored. And this is why I'm speaking of a phenomenology of rhetorical effects. And you could say there's a whole discourse developing in the Middle Ages around this because of the precarity and difficulty with these effects. It's a discourse of evaluation, of returning into it, but without ever establishing a normative pattern of evaluation. It's always a re-entering into this new world of perceptual entanglement. In addition to the rhetorical device that I just mentioned, you can go very basic. It's really a literary rhetoric and poetics that comes to the fore here. We also find certain scripts that play a role for the monks and nuns, for the spiritual people of the time. Scripts draw on biblical narratives. The Song of Songs is one of the most important ones. That is very generative for the construction or the idea of how kind of also temporal unfolding of this process can be thought. There is obviously the Passion of Christ that plays a very important role, but then also certain lives of saints. Story of the temptations of Saint Anthony plays a key role throughout the tradition, but also of Mary Magdalene in the desert and so on. The script is an important element. But the function, as I said, of both this the rhetorical technique and the narration does not consist in telling the divine something, God, something he or she would not know already. It does not provide with a hermeneutical understanding, but it functions through the production of cognitive states with specific affective and sensual qualities. The most remarkable aspect of Hume's treatise about prayer is, on one side, its rhetorical, even technical and mechanical character. It uses the scriptures, the body of religious texts, and personal experience as an archive of mimetic artifacts and procedures that can be mobilized in the practice of meditation in form of rhetorical stimuli. Based on techniques of amplification, partition, enumeration, etc., these stimuli are used in order to modify the life of the soul and to produce a dense and dramatic texture of sensation and affects. This new form of sensation and emotions can be fashioned further toward the experience of overwhelming love, which is always the goal, the ultimate goal, that informs the very practice of prayer. And that offers, I want to re-emphasize that, both a deep critique of the world and its structure of imposition, or a deep critique of the world as we perceive it as naturalized in a certain form. I want to bring a second point to your attention, if you have a little more patience. Is that okay? I don't know how long people are supposed to speak here. Okay. And namely that this what I call reweaving, the reweaving of cognition. There's maybe another footnote necessary, and that is just to give a more complete picture. And it can be illustrated with an anecdote that I use. There's the Carthusian monk who withdraws into the cell, can, so to speak, forever, and interrupts, in that sense, the natural embeddedness in the world, and now inhabits this artificial space, and the rights that now in this artificial space perceive the perception should be newly organized, so that the eschatological promise of the world perceiving and experiencing the world in its originary form, or to use Carter's word, it would be in its unoriginary form. It's just in its flow as createdness, etc., as creature, should be, this kind of perception should be reestablished. So it's a really weird setup, this radical isolation, withdrawal, but then in that situation of withdrawal, the hope to with the help of this technology that I'm trying to portray here, reshape perception so that it already now is perception in light of the promised redemption. And this is the larger framework in which that happens. And that monk, it's a Vigo, the Carthusian, in that situation also says very explicitly, normal believers are fine with the promise that this will happen at the end of time, but we want this now. It's very, very clearly, straightforwardly stated. And this is what informs or inspires the entire contemplative practice, which tries to, on the base of these rhetorical devices, restore a pre-lapsarian perception of the world, and it's in its beauty. It plays a very important role in that context. What is remarkable about this is that this also very strongly emphasizes the role of the senses in this process. It's something that actually for the historians or historians of religion, it's something that, especially in the Franciscan traditions, becomes very, very strong in the later Middle Ages, with Francis as a paradigmatic figure in this. Francis's song to preacher and the embeddedness in the preacherliness. But it's a tradition that goes all the way back actually to some of the Greek early theologians. Inheriting older teachings about the significance of the senses, they stress not primarily the significance of inner experience. That is something that would be an inner experience of the divine, but the importance of a new production of the sensory life itself. The discussion of the significance of sensation in the history of these practices of contemplation focuses, and many of you might know that, often on Ignatius of Loyola, the 16th century founder of the Jesuit order, and his spiritual exercises where the senses play a key role, based on the construction of a mental space and what he calls the application of the senses. The Ignatian model provides us with a systematic approach to prayer and meditation, where the articulation of the scripture through artifacts, sensation in general, and emotion plays a key role. However, the Ignatian model teaching the configuration of a mental space and the application of the senses within that space was not really new, except maybe, and we could say in a modern way, in its focus on a nascent bourgeois individualism. It builds on a very old tradition that speaks of the so-called 5 spiritual senses, and going back in this tradition, we could say that the theory of these inner or spiritual senses is a response to the desire for experience of the divine in light of the impossibility to understand the divine. So it's again a tension there with the hermeneutic position. It's not about understanding. And in writings of early Greek theologians, especially Origen and Gregory of Nyssa, we encounter the attempt to define the relation between man and God in terms not only of an intellectual grasp. They say it's not about gnosis, but of a reformation of cognition, particularly sensation. Using the Greek term aesthesis, Origen in this context indicates that he speaks about a cognition that transcends the rational and discursive operations of the intellect. Thus, he emphasizes that not only the scriptures are the object of each sense of the soul, such as vision for the eyes, etc., but also that the experience of the world in light of a specific form of reading the scriptures acquires a new status. There's a kind of word, if you allow me, but like Nietzsche's aesthetic justification of the world here, anticipated. Everything, we might say, is not only seen as thing and object, but as seen in this mediation through this practice of reading, which is first seen as a practice of reading, but which then from there is developed as a practice that really has the goal of, through this exercise, producing a new habitus of inhabiting the world. A new habitus formation is the goal there. What Origen emphasizes in these passages is what I call a figural aspect of the scriptures, inspired by Erich Auerbach's use and of how he develops the notion of figure, and also his emphasis on what he calls energetic realism. not an abstracting understanding or a spiritualizing allegory in the reading is here at stake, but the energeia with the energetic, he emphasizes this element, also playing with the kind of Aristotelian background, the energeia that passes through the environments as well as the reading of the texts, and that gives new life to the cognitive experience of the reader. Two elements are essential to this. First, again, an intervention that denaturalizes and isolates the realm of sensation, and that turns things and events away from their naturalized state of as objects, and turns them into figures, I call it, that emerge from a material, we could say, cosmic imagination. And that emphasis on cosmic imagination can be found in some Maximus the Confessor, for example, and others, and then again much later in Böhme. So the process or the intervention that we encounter here allows for new sensations in terms of intensity that are produced by, we call it, artificial means, that is creating a space for the deployment of the energeia that the figures in the practice of the recitation of prayers, the singing of the Psalms or the Gospels, the contemplation of images, and the meditation of scriptural verses and scenes can deploy. And playing or improvisationally playing with the energy of the words and the environments we inhabit produces thus, or they inhabit, produces a new shape of cognition, a shape that also, and that's important obviously in that eschatological perspective, these authors are working with, that transfigures the perception of the world. And it is the goal here that it is a new aesthesis, a new aesthetic, we could say, of the world, in which the world is perceived in a pre-lapsarian light, always. This would be a point. Maybe I'm just concluding here with one paragraph that brings me back to Kevin Carter. And there's anyway two little things that are to be said. I got on the refrain. At some point when I was in working on this or bringing these thoughts together, I read for another context Adorno's Minima Moralia, which concludes with that fascinating passage that resonates so deeply with Walter Benjamin. So I'll conclude with some thoughts along these lines. And there he writes, the only philosophy which can be responsibly practiced in face of despair is the attempt to contemplate all things as they would present themselves from the standpoint of redemption. That's Adorno all the way at the end of the Minima Moralia. There's a passage very in the first lines that actually reminds us of philosophy as connected to an art of life that has been forgotten. So he writes that, and then he goes on, knowledge has no light but that shed on the world by redemption. All else is reconstruction, mere technique. Perspectives must be fashioned that displace and estrange the world. So you get this one movement in there, reveal it to be with its rifts and crevices as indigent and distorted as it will appear one day in the messianic life. To gain such perspectives without velleity or violence, entirely from felt contact with its object, this alone is the task of thought. It is the simplest of all things, he says surprisingly, because the situation calls imperatively for such knowledge, indeed because consummate negativity, once scarcely faced, delineates the mirror image of its opposite. I'm not gonna interpret the last part of that sentence here for you, although all this Adorno in this very dialectical art of building this. But what is fascinating for me here is the felt contact with the object, the desire to reestablish or reconfigure a way of thought or a task of thought that is able to reestablish the felt contact seems to me very close to what is at stake in the practices that I just portrayed. In the same perspective, we can think of another element that comes into play here, and that is a tradition where the erotic, the hints to Eros itself is being foregrounded throughout the materials I just discussed. As we have seen in them, is that what is at stake is the formative force of words, first and foremost. That is their capacity to, under certain conditions, shape cognition and to give new form to the perception of the world beyond discursive distinctions, beyond the imposition of gendered, as we would say now, the racialized discourse, and on the other side, also beyond the sheer negativity of apophatic speech. It is this also that Adorno quote reflects. Drawing then the divine Eros, which is often seen as what is actually this formative force of the words, into the world, does not provide us, and this is important to me, with a more subtle or refined hermeneutic understanding of the divine, but with a new form of affective and sensitive life that in many cases is shaped by the very enactment of prayer, as I portrayed it, and the capacity to form embodied existence as it returns to itself in its material entanglements. And for the authors here, what is important is obviously the withdrawal, the abject position of humility as a starting point for the process. In this case, and I'm referring here to the tradition of prayer again, it is the practice of prayer that mobilizes the erotic energy that inhabits, from the perspective for writers right from here, mobilizes the erotic energy in the word or through the word and turns it into an alternative form of imagination and expression, or in Carter's words, to conclude with that, an alternative imagination of matter, an alternative imagination of the sacred, an alternative imagination of the social, or just another atmosphere is what he calls it. Okay, thank you very much for your.
Thank you so much. I think there is a lot to discuss. Comments, questions?
Question. This is like a, very, rich, interesting analysis. And I understand that you're just like locating like this type of look at mysticism by the moderns, to read it as like this kind of what you said is the rhetorical tool that allows us to kind of change our perception of the world and like go back to not something new, but like something that came before, right? Like that something is kind of lost, right? And I'm just like wondering, like, is this like analysis that you have? Is it just like only kind of encapsulated for the moderns, like for all these names that you gave, like Moussa, Stevenson, Duchamp, Rilke, or like the French feminists, all these people? Or is there like something we can do like right now? Because it seems to me like the descriptions that you gave, especially, are thinking about the world in a non-categorized way, like without its existing, divisions, and rethink about like all the categories of modernity. Like right now we're at a stage where everybody's into categorizing the world in their own ways, and everybody's like so sure about the ways they do it. So it doesn't feel like there is like even almost a need, because everybody feels like so self-righteous and so good about themselves. So I'm just like wondering, like, what you're thinking is.
No,
There's nothing
yeah.
you feel like nostalgic about, this has happened, and then where are we right now?
No, because I see the gist of the question, and it is for me too. It's a very somewhat dramatic moment we're at here, because you have all so the critique of monolithic truth is now everywhere. So and you have these formations of fields of knowledge that seem to emerge in all areas, every blog, every podcast, etc. But I would argue that they do it with their internal claims of truth and identity. So they're structured along these lines. So I would usually they don't see themselves as incomplete or incoherent or all these elements. They don't see themselves through a lens of this fundamental negative theology that plays a role in here. So I would still, or I would even make this stronger as a critical perspective that allows you to not produce something that is kind of the relativism that we have now, or in certain ways, but that brings you back to, or deploys a critically constructive perspective to think without these positions of identity. But still, this is not, when you, maybe one has to go one step back, it's not a critique, for example, of rational discourse overall. But when let's say, take Euclid or something like that as a figure, it is somebody who allows for rational discourse and for discursive exploration, etc., but sees all that rational discourse in light at the same time of this negative theology, which is also deployed as a negative anthropology. So the creation of a rational truth discursively is possible, but it is possible only up to a certain point where it has to recognize its own, to use the term, its own finitude. And in recognizing this finitude, where understanding can't go beyond, it actually, and that's the position of these practitioners, that it has to move back into a situation where a different kind of truth or a different kind of light is thrown onto the experience of the world or the inhabiting of the world. And there, I think that, so in that, I do see a critical potential that, for example, can be useful or can help us to think through, for example, the ecological situation in which we find ourselves. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could even say that there's a remnant of that in the modern epistemology, and even with Kant to a certain degree, of the to return into Anschauung, what in German, it's called Anschauung. But then when you think further with Adorno, with that little passage I read, you take a fullness of experience or a fullness of closeness to the things of the world, which is not the same as a culturally normative production of a naturalized world. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's a way of emphasizing a possibility of closeness or embeddedness in the world, which avoids to see the world in these terms of a normative, naturalized cultural model. So it's that kind of opening that I see here as the critical potential. And that would, I'll end with this in a minute. And that is in the language of some of these texts, a returning to the imagination, now not so much seen as an individual faculty, but as a place where in the life of the soul is always close to the life of everything else as it emerges. That in imagination, we don't just invent, or it's not a fancy, but it's returning to that movement of intimacy with the things where all rational discourse ultimately starts.
So always like the potential is there.
The potential, yeah. And it is, in that sense, it is also that negative anthropology aspect. It's returning to these potentialities.
Mm-hmm. 3 questions. Robert, myself, and Nick.
Thank you for this wonderful. My question very much follows up on the last. So I have 2 questions, or maybe it's a 2-part question. I'm not sure. First question is, I mean, to put it kind of like simplistically, the first question is about the critical potential of mysticism, and the second question is about the critique of mysticism. So on the first, I took the general thrust of the talk to be saying, to explore a little bit about why there is a contemporary interest in mysticism amongst people who would probably self-describe as critical theorists of some sort. So they're in search of the critical potentiality of mysticism. And I took you to be saying that like one prong of that is that mysticism contains within it a general, let's say, skepticism towards overly intellectual or cognitivist approaches, in its emphasis on praxis and on affect, the reorientation of sensibilities, rather than in a kind of intellectual apprehension or conceptual grasping, and that is of general interest to contemporary critical theorists, at least of this sort, because they share a concern or skepticism with this kind of overly rationalist, or what they take to be an overly rationalist orientation to critical theory. And then the second aspect was the idea of denaturalization, that you can, through some kind of self-transformation process, denaturalize one's orientation to the world and through the generation of perceptual experience. But I guess I'm a little unclear on, or skeptical, let's say, about the ability to like appropriate those 2 aspects from mysticism without taking on board the broader metaphysics of it. So it doesn't seem to me that the Christian mysticism can be appropriated for a philosophy of pure immanence without some reference to the transcendent. I mean, you mentioned parenthetically in one of the comments that the overwhelming love is always the goal, and that orientation or proximity to God is the primary goal. So there is a kind of transcendent telos, which is externally determined and precedes and a priori structures this whole process. That without that metaphysics, it seems unclear how one can just kind of like appropriate the immanent affective sensibilities of mysticism without appropriating its metaphysics. And the second aspect of that, which is probably related, is one word that you used a lot in your presentation was newness, new sensibilities, but it seems to me again that unlike a contemporary kind of postmodern appropriation of it, it's surely not novelty for its own sake. It's not intrinsically valuable to generate new perceptions or new affective orientations, in part because novelty is not intrinsically valuable, but also because you described it at one point, new sensations developed to orientate oneself to a pre-lapsarian world. So it's a newness for the sake of actually a return to origins. And that also seems like a metaphysical aspect of it that is just not possible to appropriate, like the contemporary appropriation of it without a vision of a pre-lapsarian world renders the concept of novelty completely different in it. So that's kind of like my first question, is just like these skepticisms about these contemporary appropriations. And then the second, I understand that you want in a sense to think with mysticism in a more internal vein than what I will suggest, but an external critique might say that, or might ask at least, if there's a pattern historically to when the rise and fall of mysticism, and whether it's connected to worldly disintegration, disorientation, the collapse of empires, of broader external systems, and whether read symptomatically, the contemporary interest in mysticism is really just a repetition of that, because mysticism historically provides a kind of compensatory role.
Yeah.
If we can't change the world, at least we can retreat inwardly. And so maybe the renewed interest in it is really symptomatic of that more than it is in a genuine interest in appropriating the actual content of these previous thinkers.
And that's just to start with the last one. This is also in Certeau's the mystic fable, and he describes the emergence of mysticism in the early modern times along these lines. And I want to say that I totally agree with you. There is clearly a symptomatic kind of reading that lends itself, looking at the current situation and seeing how the term is used throughout a whole range of discourses now is that I agree with that. Now I want to going back quickly to the first element, the first question. And what makes it appealing for, like, I see it both in Moten and Carter's text, but with intellectual strength, is that it's not so much the rationalist side of modernity that they address, but it is. That's why I used this Althusserian notes of interpellation, structures of interpellation, structures of that establish identities, etc. And that is what Carter, for example, and Bodnar as well, can see in the racial capitalism that characterizes modernity and that describes or assigns these identities. And it is in that context that then they rediscover is maybe the wrong word, but they engage with that tradition of thought, and they foreground certain terms. And I think that it is significant that Carter, for example, doesn't go along just with, say, okay, Lassenheit, Heidegger, etc. That kind of, he comes much closer to an understanding that I want to emphasize, which has to do with the practice. So this undoing, unsaying, these are the moments that are foregrounded. And you're right to say that, doesn't it return to a metaphysics that goes along with that? And it is there. And I would say both in Moten and Carter, there is love. Love plays a new and significant and interesting role in these discourses. And you could say in the emphasis on de-substantializing the divine, which is characteristic in that context. They also rejoin something, and I don't want to bring it back to that, but just an interesting thought that is already there in the theological tradition when it does not want to be just an illustration of a metaphysical system of thought. And that, for example, in this famous Dionysius Areopagita, the exploration of negative theology and positive theology, apophatic speech, one of these founding figures in thinking about that, where he moves beyond this exactly in the emphasis on practice. There is something happening there where he actually playing in the text with Plato's Symposium and the speeches in praise of Eros, shifts from, there's not just negative speech, there's not just positive speech, there is in between a way of speaking in which overwhelming praise, for example, pulls in the Eros that inhabits everything. And that is a point where, for me at least, both in these, now thinking of Carter and Moten as two examples, and in Dionysius Areopagita, the distinction between transcendence and immanentia, between or the isolation of a metaphysical level, doesn't really make sense. So it's not a metaphysics that undergirds it all. It's somehow that in the practice, and that's this energia moment, and obviously Christian theologians would say, oh yeah, it's a moment of grace, or it's the spirit, etc. There are explanatory models there available, but it's not an illustration of it. So it's the reality of love that comes through. And when Moten does the same thing when he talks about the slave songs, and from the hull, the nothingness, the hull of the slave ships. The very, very fascinating way in which he develops it, and then the tradition of the gospel coming out of that has this same force, not the gospel as illustration of a metaphysical belief, but as the reality of the transformation of the perception of the world. And does that make sense? Which is for I think for him, but I can't speak for him, but which at least alludes to an understanding of law, which then as philosophers, we would say, oh, it's the invocation of a metaphysical principle, but maybe one could say, no, it's not the invocation of a metaphysical, because that's obviously when we understand it discursively, but in its practice, it is the presence of what is happening there, namely transgressing into a different form of perception of the world that comes through this practice. Does that make
Yeah, I guess I heard a little on the word perception, the transformation of the perception of the world,
or the inhabited
separation
using
between seeing and being.
A different, and people nowadays we really always use that word entanglement also. But it's the inhabiting, perception is a difficult term there, because it's, I don't have a really good term, at least now on my mind. And it's the interaction that is, it's everything that is a statement. It's the ethos, it's an ethical transformation. Maybe one should call it that.
So my question actually starts with the perception, but is strictly related to what Robert was saying. So I think historically we can say that mystics want to redefine or reconfigure or reshape perception and the perception of the world, because the world cannot longer be perceived as it was.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a kind of, something that is related to the crisis of all the traditional categories or the way we perceive the world for many reasons. Theology, legal reason, the empire is falling apart, the hierarchical order of the Middle Ages is falling apart. Many things are falling apart. And these mystics in the pre/pro-modern time, they were trying to deal with that. And now it's possible to do many parallels with the present or with the 20th century in the 20s, when Benjamin was saying similar things. All the traditional categories are falling apart. They are no longer appropriate to understand our world. And then he said that in a very long reflection on perception in the age of technical reproducibility. This is how the essay began. So now the differences, this is my question. My question is about the difference between, let's say, pre-modern mysticism and today's reactivation of some mystical elements. Because I see, and I took note of some of the terms that you used in historical mysticism. We have an emphasis on undoing, on defiguration, on a process that doesn't end in any moment of identification. I would add another term that I really like, that is entwerden. Mm-hmm. So this kind of this becoming. So all these terms are a kind of a negative term. Now, my question is, why are they negative? They are negative because my understanding of historical mysticism, for the reason that we say, perception of the world, is how is possible, probably unconsciously, to make a room for a different way of perceiving the world, making a room for a different way of thinking about the world. I don't think they were intentionally oriented in redefining positively new thinking and new perceptions. The point was we needed to make a room for something else because everything is falling apart, and they could make that room, but they could make a room also because there was for them a kind of orientation in that falling apart of a Lebensfeld, of a world. And the orientation, that was what Robert said, was given by transcendence, was given by God. So there was an orientation. So it's possible to create room because at the same time we have a sense of a God, a sense of a transcendence. We have a sense of infinity, and we can create a room because we can basically experience that the world in which we live is a finite, is a limited, and therefore there is a room for something else. And now I think so. The question is where I want to end my question and comment is does it make sense? A kind of a immanent mysticism. So a mysticism without orientation, a mysticism without transcendence, a mysticism without God. So that kind of a mysticism looks to me instead, actually the opposite. Instead of a making room, is a mysticism that will saturate the world with a new language, with new terms, with new identities, with new desires, with new everything. But it's actually the opposite. So if the historical mysticism could make room, the new mysticism, if there is such a thing as an immanent mysticism, it would end, or the outcome of an immanent mysticism is just a saturation. That is my sense. But it is a question.
They mean a saturation with possibility.
With possibility that you can achieve. Become what you want.
Yeah.
Realize what you desire. That is basically today's discourse.
No, and that's also one of the problems I do have with this, with like what came up in these conversations about the psychedelics and mystics. So you get this, and even the appropriation of all kinds of native indigenous traditions, and then in a totally different context. Yeah. I agree with you. I still would say, I mean, we obviously have difficulties to return to a medieval, what we believe to be a medieval kind of theocentric metaphysics. That has been lost.
Yeah.
And right now, in our situation, we inhabit the moment where we don't even know, and even it seems to me that most recently it comes when we sit and we do this, and the artificial intelligence is doing so many things we don't know, and what's actually happening, and the categories are falling apart. To be very, very, very personal, I mean, I still think there is, the love is in that sense just another name for, and maybe a still palpable name for a divine, and some of the texts I'm dealing with and some of these modern re-engagements, they are for my taste too, maybe a little bit too deconstructivist. Yeah. So they take that little deconstructivist refuge. It's like what you get with Derrida, then you have suddenly the absolute moments, Louis, the promise, etc. You get these moments. And so I wouldn't use that as an escape route, so to speak. But maybe it is a necessity to acknowledge this kind of absoluteness of love as it goes through not just as it goes through a tradition of thought and practical engagements of humans as being in the world. And then I wouldn't be afraid of going with Plato's Symposium and have a genealogy of something which I think is deeply at stake in that mystical tradition throughout. Even when you think about Musil's novel, Without Politics, which in the end, I don't know whether the chapters when it's all finished, but very much turns around this, the question of love. So, yeah, I agree with you that without, but I wouldn't call it, but why not? Yeah, maybe we should call it a metaphysical principle. Yeah.
Or and then I stop. Or so maybe another dimension is the psychology of the mystic, because at the same time, so what I know about mysticism is that it really addresses suffering, and so it's not an immediate experience of beatitude. It goes through internal suffering that I think is a part of this tension between, if you want, transcendence and the finitude. Is the tension between these two elements, and the difficulty of living your life in that tension. And I think, and then I really stop, probably this is what can be lost in a kind of immanent mysticism.
Yeah.
So it's a mysticism without a tension, and that is what can be lost.
For tension, you I just add one thing, but that is very important to me, and that's also what gets forgotten in the focus on the kind of the sublime ecstatic experience, that it is all when you move through this text or reading through this text, it is always this, as you say, tension, suffering, it's dramatic.
Yeah.
So in that sense, the invocation also of the metaphysical principle, law, let's call it that, is not straightforward. It is only through that drama. And what I said before, in answer to your question before, can the undoing of kind of the discursive framework that we inhabit and that we need, obviously, and of the hermeneutics of language and so on, the undoing of that and kind of opening towards that, the love as it permeates what I call perception, is always dramatic. It's not the straightforward, yes, and I moved from here to here, but sorry.
I have a figure.
Yeah.
So as a kind of a possibility for the immanent mysticism that you're talking about, that where, you without God or without transcendence, you kind of lose orientation, or you say that you cannot, it's not attentive. What about the beauty? Like you mentioned the role of beauty, like that's because the aesthetic experience is also about shifting the perception, right? That perceptual shift. So why can't beauty do the job that God does? And then it will just like some kind of immanent form of mysticism, but with the aesthetics. And I'm surprised, it's not so surprising that like there's just all this interest now in kind of mystical, painters who were into mysticism, like Hilma of Klimt, like Sonia Delaunay. Like there was just like recently even at Guggenheim, there's a exhibition in Orphism. Yeah. So what I can't. Maybe we don't need God.
But what?
Yeah, well, we have beauty. We don't need God.
They all talk about this in one breath, you could say. Beauty and eros. It really is these two things. And you think of all the early Christian theologians, in the Greek tradition in particular, it's all beauty and the eros. But as together, and the convertibility from both. But the question then I have for you as a philosopher also, because it is not beauty as the disinterested play of the imagination, but then the question comes, so how do you deal with this without falling back, I would call it, into a normative context or into the question of normative? So that's why the beauty eros conjunction will always have a moment of transcendence. And that moment, but you could say, so because they operate with the same examples we do, they would say, when they feel like this, when I imaginary this, look out at the tree, and then you see, obviously, you remove yourself from, you don't understand it. It's the aesthetic experience. You see it in the originary light of its creaturely coming forth in its beauty. That's in its beauty. And then they get to the beauty, eros, you're drawn to it. It's all these elements come into play. And that way, then you can use it. That's where the term energeia, energy, spirit, grace, this configuration of terms comes into play for the theological discourse, which it doesn't stipulate, and none of them do, like a substantial deity, but it references a kind of plenitude that comes through. So that's then, but that's already when the early theologians, Gregory of Nyssa, so they all think already about that. They don't want to be caught up in a divine, transcendent, substantial, they're interested, especially with the incarnational paradigm for Christianity, that is very foreground, that it is an immanent fullness that is available. But it is. Yeah, maybe there's just no way around theology. Yeah. So I'm saying that now in sentence. It might be a very romantic. In Berkeley too, and in Berkeley now it's changed. So when I came to it, the radically secular institution, which I approve of.
So for people interested in thinking about the politics of liberation or some kind of collective revolutionary process, I think it's difficult to read the mystics and not see, or at least think about the kind of contemporary mystical practice or interest in the mystics as something other than a counter-revolutionary force, which is kind of what we're sort of talking about. And I think that must be related to something you said early on in the talk, which was about a difficulty we have reading the mystics, where we impose modern selfhood on our reading of the mystics, and we can categorize their practice along with kind of modern mindfulness, which, like Google pays for mindfulness coaches for their employees, or at least they used to do this. I don't know, but the Protestant ethic, where monasticism kind of comes out of the monasteries and into our everyday lives, and asceticism becomes a virtue. It's asceticism that is instrumentalized for purposes of optimization and production. And I'm not a ethnographer of modern mindfulness, but my conception of it is that the idea is that our nature has been kind of degraded or mutated by the modern world, and we need to engage these mindful practices in order to demutate or something and get back to our nature, which is self-regulating and stable, so that these things are not roadblocks in our everyday lives as workers. But what I was thinking about when you were speaking is that in that kind of way of thinking about like mindfulness, nature is the virtue, and getting back to like this kind of originary natural form. But one thing that you emphasized in the talk was that mystical practice and the monastery as a kind of technology is really about generating an experience of artificiality. And when we were talking about like getting back to an originary experience, it's actually an originary experience of artificiality and of being a creature or being created by something that is outside the world. And the modern mindfulness person could look at their situation, I suppose, as being created by Google or something.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a big difference between being a creature of Google or capitalism or whatever, and being a creature of this force that is kind of indeterminate force outside the world.
Yeah. And the dramatization is maybe a kind of a decisive difference that you find in the mystical tradition, namely that it is not a tradition just of, as you characterize it, mindfully adjusting to a natural state, but it is a sharp, kind of active dramatization of the state that we inhabit and that we believe to be natural, as a state that is deeply, and you could use the word alienated, unjust, violent, and unfree. But it's a word that is used throughout the tradition too. It is discursively framed. It assigns identities, and thus it is like a prison to the natural world, things like that, because of the post-lapsarian state. I mean, we are all caught up in that. So we do with that kind of, and now the dramatization that they produce is withdrawing from that, seeing it as, to use this dangerous word, inauthentic, and in dramatizing, then holding in these possibilities to experience the world different. And differently would mean in light of redemption, for example. But it also goes, I mean, it's not always so global or total. It informs every single moment of articulation, you could say. So in every single moment, there is that withdrawing, denaturalizing gestures, and then in counteracting it, you could actually call it also a kind of a poetics of existence, to move into a different register here. That is, you say to yourself, or you go through certain lines in your head, or produce certain artifice of music and text. You sing a song to yourself. For example, is actually very concretely what's happening. And in that singing that song to yourself in your head, now I'm afraid of using the word perception again, but your atmospheric state changes. And it's about that change of that atmospheric state, which never succeeds, because you always fall back into the naturalization and etc. And so you have to kind of continuously produce this drama in which freedom lives, of kind of in denaturalizing again, going beyond again, etc. There's a moment of transgression, and there is, to come back to that minute, there is an affinity between that and the revolutionary, social revolutionary thought that some of them developed out of this setup. It's not. It's not the case that these are two totally different things. There is a social revolutionary energy or impetus that can build on this, and I do think that it has also to do with the fact that you started with this, that we shouldn't read it too individualistically. That they don't just think about a transformation of themselves. They think about the transformation of the world that is at stake. It's not just their own individual salvation, so to speak. They really mean that investment. That's maybe where I see one of the fundamental differences between current mindfulness, which is more of a therapy, which also has its right, and less of a kind of a global transformation influence.
We have time for more questions or comments.
I actually have a question. It's connected to the ones that have already been asked, and it has to do with the relationship between blackness and mysticism, at least in Carter and Moten. And at one point you mentioned kind of proto-black mysticism at Moten. Is that correct? Is that the phrase that he uses?
Proto-black
mysticism.
Black mysticism. Yeah, that's what Carter uses.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering what the relationship would be if mysticism involves a denaturalization of culturally constructed natural categories. And if blackness is such a category, then is there a kind of difficulty in fitting those two things together? Or is blackness being used, let's say by Moten, as a technique, as a way of, let's say, denaturalizing a certain understanding of blackness, of denaturalizing, let's say, racialized capitalism or racist understanding of blackness, but that ultimately it isn't necessarily a metaphysics that might substitute for, say, a traditional Christian metaphysics or even beauty, but just more, it's a practice.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have any transcendent quality, or does it have transcendent quality? Is that an attempt to, in fact, anchor, let's say, this proto-black mysticism in a transcendent understanding of blackness that may only be accessible to Black people, for example, or have some privileged status in the way that Christian mystics might say Christianity has a privileged status, or Jewish mystics might say that Jewish mystics. I mean, in a way, this gets into the broader question of, are any of these varieties of mysticism privileged in any way vis-a-vis the other ones? Or are they just different means for achieving some relationship to an ultimate, transcendent ultimate that is the same? It's just that, historically, people end up in these different communities and therefore different. One says it's Fana, one says it's Bittel, one says it's, Mystica. They all believe in, giving up annihilation of self, and then ultimately you achieve some higher state.
I would say, just thinking back to the text of Moten in particular, it plays this double role for the notion of blackness, that on one side it is assigned racially, it's part of the racial capitalism, to use this, of modernity, to assign that to people. And so insofar you could say it's an identity that has to be unknown, like other identities. But on the other side, because of the specificity in which blackness has been produced, that's how I understand it, it rejoins the nothingness where it is close to the divine. So that speaking from the point of view of blackness is speaking from the point of view of having been denied all positive determination. And in that sense, it is like a speaking from to use that sentence, it is closer to the divine in its ungraspability. But I think there is also a line that goes from there to a different way, and a provocative different way of seeing a potential to rethinking the human exactly through that figure of blackness as endowed with that potential. Does that make sense?
It does. It's connected to Black theology.
Yes, and it is connected to Black theology.
Yeah.
And to this place when in Morton's essay, which is part of the book, the connection then to music is very important as an articulation of that voice which has been denied, and by assigning it this identity, which is a non-identity, which is never allowed to be an identity. And so the connection with the music as a place from which this non-determining way can be deployed is very important.
It does suggest that there's a metaphysics,
yes,
that this gives access to.
And it is always, I would say, it is love plays always comes up suddenly as a word, usually, or not in many cases yet capitalized as a term that references this metaphysics. Yeah. But it is, I think it is throughout, it is connected to Black theology. And to a perspective, yes, a perspective of salvation that can be retrieved only in assuming this position of indeterminacy, which is the position also of the ones who have been deprived of their own voice. It's this figure of thought that I see at play there, and which I find very powerful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.